Well, good morning to everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American German Institute here in Washington, D.C., and we are really pleased to offer today's webinar, which is titled Promises, Power, and Protection: The West's Debate Over Security Guarantees for Ukraine. I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment, but let me observe at the start that there could be no timelier presentation, I think, because the last several days of diplomatic engagement and misadventure that have surrounded the emergence of a 28-point peace plan for Ukraine, which was the result of U.S. and Russian discussions. It has cast light on a number of fundamental aspects of any settlement of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And one of those is Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and ongoing security arrangements to deter future conflict. And that's why I'm so pleased that we have with us today Dr. Iulian Romanyshyn, who will present the results of his research. Iulian has been a visiting DAAD AGI visiting research fellow here at AGI for the last several months, and he will present the results of his work. Dr. Iulian Romanyshyn is senior fellow and lecturer at the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn. He is also the head of the scientific program at the Institute for International Cooperation, Technological Diplomacy, and Communication. He has previously held research and teaching positions in Europe and in the United States. A list far too long to get into, but suffice it to say, he has deep knowledge and experience in this field, and we're really privileged to have had him with us here for these last few months. So the format of this event, we will have a presentation by Iulian, which will be followed by discussion. And so to all of you who wish to participate in the discussion, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. I will moderate the discussion and will try to bring all the questions into our subsequent deliberations. So with that, Iulian, personal thanks from my side for being here with us. We've really benefited from your engagement here at the Institute, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. And before I begin, I would like to thank you, AGI, for hosting me here in Washington. It's been an incredible, productive, but also turbulent few months here with lots of interesting inputs and conversations that I had that shaped my thinking about this question and about where the transatlantic security agenda stands today. And of course, I would like to thank German Academic Exchange Service for their generous financial support. I would now start sharing my screen. So you can see my presentation and slides. I hope it is visible now. Right. So ever since Russia has invaded Ukraine in 2014, the major questions that has been on the minds of transatlantic policymakers is what sort of military assistance they can provide to Ukraine and how. And in 2022, it became all the more obvious that if Ukraine is left alone, it is highly vulnerable to Russia's imperial designs. And of course, this debate reached a boiling point during the infamous White House meeting in the February 2025. And most of you are familiar with this image. The meeting between the US and American presidents, when President Trump and his team pressed President Zelensky on the question of peace talks. And Zelensky insisted that Kyiv will not agree to any peace deal that does not provide security guarantees to prevent renewed Russian aggressions. Because in Ukraine's mind, they know that Russia's maximalist goals remain still the same. It's about subjugating the Ukrainian state. We also know that Russia has a very poor track record of respecting international law, and so crafting an effective security guarantee is really a key question here. And this is the question that I was trying to engage within during my research. How does this security guarantee can look like, and what kind of measures can we put in place to prevent a renewed Russian attack in the future? And the answer that I came up with is perhaps a little counterintuitive, but I argue that the security guarantee comes largely from within of Ukraine, from the strength of its armed forces, from the effective ability of Ukraine to defend itself. So if we think of this about as in terms of the solar system, so essentially Ukraine's indigenous capabilities are the core of the system, it's the sun. And then we can think about different additional elements, satellites, so to say. So it can be economic sanctions, frozen Russian assets, or the question of societal resilience. But one particular supplement, one particular satellite that I would like to add here and focus on is the question of European troops deployed to Ukraine. So this is the magic formula that I suggest. Ukraine's armed forces as the core, and European troops on the ground as a supplement. I don't want you to bore along with the concepts and definitions, but just to very briefly, the logic of security guarantees is inherently related to the question of deterrence. What is deterrence? Deterrence is about preventing an action that you don't want by threatening to impose unacceptable consequences if the action is taken. So, in other words, dissuasion by means of threat. And successful deterrence typically depends on two factors. On a combination of capability and credibility. So capability is about the means and instruments with which a defending actor can enforce uh, a deterrent threat over its adversary. And credibility is basically about the resolve, the determination to use those instruments. So the higher the capability, the higher the credibility, the higher chance the deterrence will be successful. So we need to have both. And another important distinction here is between deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. So deterrence by denial is based on threatening your adversary that he or she will not achieve its objectives. So in other words, it's a deterrence based on fear of failure. While deterrence by punishment is about imposing severe costs, severe penalties on an aggressor if it attacks. So deterrence based on the fear of pain. So having that in mind, I think it's useful just to step back and to reflect on why the transatlantic community was not successful in 2022 and failed to deter Russia from invading Ukraine in February. And many emphasize the factor that the successive US presidents actually consistently fell short of punishing Russia for invading its neighbors, starting with Georgia in 2008. President Obama's strategy in response to Moscow was not to escalate, to the extent even that some of his officials actually pressed Ukrainian counterparts to refrain from armed resistance. And of course, there were some limited sanctions that followed, and they didn't really amount to any serious price that one has to pay if one conquers the territory of sovereign state. To his credit, President Biden did warn Moscow about massive economic consequences. He warned Moscow about reinforcements that will be sent to NATO's eastern flank around the time when Russia started to build up their military forces around Ukraine. But given the West's previous record of poor record of imposing costs on Russia, these deterrence threats may have not looked credible in Putin's eyes. In addition, the problem with Biden's deterrence plan was that most of his threats, deterrence threats, were almost exclusively related to the fact that they will be exercised only after Russia strikes Ukraine. So really, and very little considerations were given to attempts actually to prevent or preempt essentially to deny Russians a quick victory in Ukraine. And indeed, the death knell of deterrence policy of Biden was the fact that he back then multiple times in public and repeatedly emphasized that there will be no preemptive deployment of American troops on the Ukrainian soil. And more than that, he actually authorized existing US military personnel to leave Ukraine in the early 2022. So without the threat of armed force on the table, not just credibility, but also the capability equation of US deterrence policy was greatly undermined. And of course, we had this statement from back then in February from General Mark Milley, the former chairman of Joint Chief of Staff, who reportedly told congressmen that essentially repeating the Russian narrative that Kyiv would fall within 72 hours, which may send a signal to Moscow, the US is just disengaging. So bottom line is here that there was very little in terms of fear of pain and almost nothing in terms of fear of failure that crossed Putin's mind in February 2022 before he pulled the trigger. And it's also worth reflecting on how the different administrations actually approached the question of security guarantees. So in terms of the Biden administration, the central question that was on the agenda was about NATO's membership of Ukraine. Of course, the Biden administration was trying to embrace this question, even though they questioned the viability of this idea. The senior officials in the administration back then started to develop different ideas about NATO membership. Some of them were discussing the question, the West Germany, so-called West Germany model, when NATO would protect when NATO would protect Ukraine only to the extent of the Ukraine's unoccupied territory. Another model that was discussed was the Norway model, essentially extending Article 5 for Ukraine, but not placing any NATO troops in Ukraine. But these ideas, however, rested on the premise that the war should come to an end. But there were even those who claimed that NATO can actually admit Ukraine during the war. So I would say the Ukraine model, and essentially draw the line and say that they will protect Ukraine in only uncontested parts of Ukrainian territory. And while Biden was weighing different pros and cons, he ultimately decided not to endorse Ukraine's membership into NATO in the immediate term for two reasons. First, admitting Ukraine was perceived to incur massive risk of escalation for the US in terms of confronting Russia. And then we know that the fear of escalation was a major impediment factor, major factors that defined the overall Biden's overcautious approach to the military support of Ukraine. But second, US officials were also concerned about lack of consensus among Europeans. Major European powers like UK and France seem to be sympathetic towards Ukraine's membership in NATO. But there were those like Germany, specifically under Chancellor Scholz, who were adamantly opposed to the idea, maybe even more than the US. And of course, we know that about the Hungary's and Slovakia's position. And so, with no consensus on this question, essentially, Biden administration, instead of NATO membership, started to champion this idea of bilateral security agreements for Ukraine between Ukraine and individual EU NATO allies, and Ukraine to date signed, I think, more than 25 of them with individual countries. And all these agreements promised some different levels of military support, but none of them amounted to a legally binding document, a legally binding agreement, and pledging a mutual defense commitment. So what Ukraine really wanted. And Entering the Trump administration, of course, the U.S. views on security guarantees for Ukraine shifted profoundly, and this shift uh, reflected a broader shift in how the United States views its role in the world and its role in Europe. And to some extent, the shift can be summed up by three assumptions. So first, the current administration doesn't really believe that the U.S. has vital interest in Europe, that the European security is necessary for American security. And this is not only just a shift from the Biden era, but also the shift from previous decades of US policy on Europe. Second, that the war in Ukraine is an exclusively European problem. And the third, that Russian victory in Ukraine is not a national security threat to the United States. And so this minimalistic vision of US role in Europe, coupled with Trump's exclusive focus on the short term to get a deal with Russia, actually precluded a serious engagement with the question of security guarantees. We know that one of the first announcements of the US was in February 2025 that the NATO membership of Ukraine is off the table, and instead, Biden, Trump administration started to play with this idea of Ukraine mineral deal and how actually Ukraine can drive its security simply from the economic partnership with the US and from the US investments in Ukraine's mineral sector. Trump's administration repeatedly emphasized that it's up to Europe to defend Ukraine's post-war long-term security. And it was not until August 2025 when Trump explicitly acknowledged the need for security guarantees, and he provided a vague promise to help um, Europeans with the deployment of reassurance force in Ukraine after the ceasefire. However, the scale of this U.S. help or U.S. backdrop was not clear until now, but it seems unlikely to involve American troops on the ground. Interestingly, this lukewarm position of the administration of the Trump's administration is actually in contradiction with what American public wants. This is the opinion poll from the Harvard's Center for American Political Studies, and here we can see that not only American voters actually asking government to continue to provide weapons to Ukraine and impose sanctions on Russia. So that's the left graph here. More importantly, they actually believe that Ukraine deserves to get security guarantees from the US if it commits to negotiating a resolution to the war. And this is very strong. There is a very strong consensus, close to 70% of voters across all political spectrum that says that Ukraine needs to have security guarantees. So as NATO's protective umbrella remains outside of the reach in the immediate term, it seems prudent to suggest that the deterrence arrangement that will guarantee Ukraine's security between today and the day Ukraine eventually will join NATO is the arrangement that is based on primarily based on Ukraine's internal indigenous capabilities. It implies that Ukraine needs to possess capabilities to be able to effectively defend itself from the future Russian attacks. And to some extent, Ukraine already has those capabilities. With more than 10 years of battlefield experience of holding Russia back, Ukrainian armed forces are viewed as one of the most important tools in this deterrence for credible deterrence regime. Ukraine has around 900,000 people in uniform today, and it spends around 34% of GDP on defense spending, which is the highest military burden in the world. But of course, Ukraine is still dependent on military assistance from its partners. Air defense systems are the most critical shortfall um, needed to effectively exercise deterrence by denial against relentless Russian attack on Ukraine's civilian and critical infrastructure. Um, and another critical gap in Ukraine's military capabilities is the long-range missiles and air force. Ukraine needs a massive purchase and massive production of cruise and ballistic missiles with a range of over 1,000 kilometers. And these capabilities are needed because they will enable Ukraine essentially to put at risk something that Putin's regime values the most. And these are two things: the energy infrastructure and military production facilities. And of course, the Tomahawk missiles that have been green-lighted apparently by Pentagon for Ukraine fit very well into this um, effort to build a capable deterrence by punishment. Another element of deterrence toolbox is Ukraine's defense industry that has become a major source of innovation and growth in the country. According to Ukrainian leaders, today already 60% of the weapons that are used in the front lines are domestically produced. What is more, according to Ukraine's foreign minister, Ukraine can actually produce next year up to 20 million drones, which is 10 times more than Ukraine produced in 2024, but only on the condition that there is enough financing. And that points to a problem that which is about the lack of funding, lack of financing. Currently, Ukrainian defense industry has an output production output of around 35 billion dollars, and only half of this can the government can fund. So this points to this raises the question for policymakers of how can we um, uh, how can we provide sustainable funding for Ukrainian defense industry, and also how can we put the military assistance on more institutionalized level, from ad hoc to more institutionalized mechanisms, in order to provide what's colleagues at Carnegie called qualitative deterrence balance, when essentially helping Ukraine to match and offset any Russian military advantages by providing a mix of superior equipment, technologies, training, and so on. So that's the core of the security guarantees, the core of the security guarantees arrangement. But how about the supplements or the additional element, which is about European troops on the ground? Now, the possibility of sending Western troops to Ukraine was actually raised for the first time in February 2024 by French President Macron, and the idea at that time was not met with much enthusiasm among allies, and the strongest signs of disapproval actually came from Washington and Berlin, who appeared to be, as before, consumed with the fear of escalation. No matter that Russia just completed a few months earlier a deployment of nuclear weapons in Belarus, and a couple of months later, Russia will invite North Korean troops to join its fight against Ukraine. But things have changed with election of President Trump, when the new administration appeared to redefine its commitments to European security. And in February 2025, France and the UK announced the creation of the European Coalition of the Willing to support Ukraine's sovereignty and to uphold a possible future ceasefire. And after many rounds of military planning in September this year, Macron announced that there are 26 countries committed to contribute to the reassurance force to be sent to Ukraine. So what kind of forms or what kind of shape this reassurance force can take in Ukraine? The operation details, of course, remain secret, but it is safe to assume that European troops will contribute to a second line of defense after the Ukrainian military. So therefore, they will not be deployed to the front line. But we can think about this coalition with this reassurance force mission in terms of its maximalist version and its minimalist version. So um, the more ambitious format can assume the rapid reaction force. So we're talking about 60, 80,000 troops, combat-ready troops that can help Ukrainian military to break through Russian defensive lines in case Russia violates a ceasefire. The less ambitious format would include the training and capacity building mission to Ukrainian armed forces, especially in the area of a combined arms operation, but also related to guarding critical infrastructure, to protecting the border with Moldova or Belarus. So essentially, all the measures that will relieve Ukrainian military from some of those existing tasks and will allow them to refocus their attention on more urgent ones. Of course, there are challenges with this mission. One of them, most critical, is about the role of the US. What sort of contribution the US can provide to this reassurance force. And the US seem to be open to provide Europeans with so-called strategic enablers, intelligence, surveillance, logistical support, transport, and so on. But beyond the American strategic enablers, there is a question of whether the US will get involved if European troops are attacked in Ukraine. Another question is how long actually this deployment can be sustained. We are aware about the financial constraints in many European countries and also the shortage of military personnel and growing domestic problems, quite frankly, in the UK and France. So all these factors can undermine the joint the stability and sustainability of the Franco-British led mission. And in addition, other European powers with significant military capabilities like Germany, Italy, or Poland have actually been hesitating or openly dismissive about the idea of sending troops to Ukraine, which arguably also undermines the potential viability of this force. So if we try to plot these different measures in terms of in the matrix of capability and credibility, the two major factors that I mentioned in the beginning, the two major conditions for deterrence, we can think about different types. So of depending on how low or high credibility or lower or higher capability. So at the lower right and lower left squares are actually the hypothetical emissions that I haven't mentioned. For example, a joint expeditionary force mission to be deployed to Ukraine once Russia violates an agreement, a peace agreement, or air policing from outside. I think the peace plan that was suggested last week mentioned something about NATO planes to be stationed in Poland. So these are the measures that arguably will have low credibility because they are based on the idea of troops to be sent from outside, so not to be placed in Ukraine. The areas that I mentioned, or the areas that we are looking at, is this one. So the higher left and higher right squares. So the maximalist version on the right and minimalist version on the left. And regardless of the scale and shape of the reassurance force, whether we are on whether it's more a maximalist or more ambitious or more or less ambitious mission, Western boots on the ground will make a difference. And I would argue for two reasons, because first of all, they will increase interdependency between Ukraine's security and a NATO security, and will essentially contribute to effective deterrence by denial. But more importantly, forward-based troops is essentially the most tangible indicator of the willingness to fight. So placing forces in Ukraine gives its partners so-called skin in the game. And this is exactly what was missing in February 2022 when Russia launched this full-scale invasion. So just to conclude, the main when we talk about the model of security guarantees, the main source of Ukraine security guarantee comes from within. So it is about providing Ukraine with all it needs to defend itself, and uh, empowering its defense industry, maximizing its military assistance, providing right kind of weapons and no restrictions on its use. And also, I would say that because this strength comes from within, we also start observing interesting trends. And one, for example, when in September 2025, Russian drones penetrated the airspace of Poland and Romania, the NATO members actually asked Ukraine for help with drone defense. So this was a stunning reversal from established military assistance patterns, which signaled that Ukraine is actually turning from a security consumer to security provider, uh, which is an interesting observation. Also, if we remember what has been suggested by President Zelensky last year in his post-war vision or peace plan, that actually that Ukraine can replace some of the U.S. Troops in Europe if U.S. Decides to withdraw. So this makes it even more important that no restrictions are placed on Ukrainian armed forces and their links with Western militaries as a part of a negotiated deal with Russia. And until Ukraine's membership in NATO remains blocked, the European troops on the ground offer an interim solution. What we've seen in the past months that the efforts of Europeans to craft this reassurance force was a remarkable example of European agency, European leadership without the US. And the more Europeans actually do to provide for their defense, the more they exercise this agency, the more likely I would say that they will keep US supported. And perhaps even Europeans should lead by example and dispatch some of those elements of reassurance force prior to ceasefire. And finally, I want to add with this quote from one of my interview partners who probably sum it up very well, saying, "Until the West shows the willingness to fight, Russia will not be deterred." So I will leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Iulian, for a really terrific presentation, and I look forward to getting into discussion. I see we have some questions already popping up in the queue, and I encourage everyone once again to use the Q&A function if you would like to offer an observation or ask a question in response to the presentation. But maybe to get us started, Iulian, over the last several days, there has been a lot of focus on this 28-point plan, which was leaked first to the media and then confirmed. And there have been discussions yesterday in Geneva between the U.S. and the Ukrainian sides as well. Can you offer your own assessment of the security aspects of of the either the 28-point plan or the European response, which I think had 23 points, or the outcomes that we've heard at least the early outcomes of the U.S.-Ukrainian discussions. How do those look in light of the deterrence requirements that you've outlined in some detail here?
Right. Thanks, Jeff.
Mhm.
Yes, the 28 point peace plan. Um, well, I think apart from the fact that it was very much favorable to Russia and essentially repeated many of the Russians' demands, there was one element there that uh, caught attention, and I think this was the element that some of the U.S. administration officials tried to um, highlight to Ukrainians the fact that there will be, according to this plan, some sort of uh, Article 5 like commitment of the transatlantic community to come to Ukraine's defense if Russia attacks. And so, and this perhaps this is one of the indicators that the administration officials do finally understand the need for this sort of the relevance and the importance of these security guarantees for Ukraine. But this provision there are a lot of questions about this part specifically related to security guarantee. I mean, first of all, it's not clear how from this document how exactly this mechanism will work. So we might be looking at some sort of Budapest Memorandum Redux, essentially a declaration that the help will come, but with no credible teeth. Um, uh, Kind of just creating the illusion of security guarantee where in fact there is none. But interestingly, if one looks at the 28 peace point plan, after this provision on a security guarantee by Article 5 like, there is another provision that actually negates this one, and that is one that says that no NATO militaries can be placed in Ukraine. Um, so how would you defend Ukraine without placing troops forward? This goes essentially against the NATO's logic of forward defense that it put forward, that we adopted in Madrid with its new strategic concept. Um, and again, as I mentioned before, the forward based troops is the most tangible indicator of the willingness to fight. This is the most credible from the point of view of deterrence theory. But there are also more questions, right? So to what extent, how far would you trust the US administration, whose president doesn't really distinguish between victim and aggressor, who on many occasions tended to side with Russia when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and who finds a comfort in pressuring um, the weaker side of while unwilling, not unable, but unwilling to actually exercise the all the leverage it has to bring Russia to the negotiation table. Um, and finally, if this is actually indeed Article uh, uh, 5 like mechanism, one could just say, well, so why wouldn't you simply bring Ukraine into NATO?
It's a fair point. I think the point that you make about the the need for capability and credibility in any kind of security guarantee and deterrence arrangement is particularly apt also in light of the plan's proposal that there should be a cap on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, which although the 28-point plan starts off with a reaffirmation of Ukraine's sovereignty. It then it proceeds to limit Ukraine's sovereignty in all sorts of ways, as well as limiting the choices that European countries, whether they're members of NATO or the European Union, can make.
It's full of ambiguities and full of contradictions, I would say. As you mentioned, Jeff. So on the one hand, in this plan, Russia commits not to attack Ukraine, not to attack other NATO member states, European states. There is this absolutely laughable provision that Russia will enshrine it into its law, and yeah, how far you can trust with to country without the domestic rule of law and that doesn't respect international law, that this law will constrain them from attacking from well, okay, but putting that aside, so if you're not planning to attack, why then would why would you request uh, caps on Ukrainian army? Why would you request to cut military assistance? Um, so there are lots of contradictions here, and and of course, if you want add to this the fact that Russians wanted to have those unoccupied part of Donbass that have as a important also strategic purpose, defensive purpose. They will get a lifeline from the lifted sanctions. Um, and again, caps still on Ukrainian militaries. This for me sounds like a perfect recipe for another invasion, especially knowing that there will be no forward deployed Western troops in Ukraine.
Right. Let me turn to some of the questions that are beginning to pop up. The first one is a question: do you have an estimate of how many European troops would be necessary, and what their roles should be in this scenario that you've sketched out? Is there some minimal level? Is there some ideal level in order to complement Ukraine's indigenous strength, which is the core of the plan, but then that to provide the necessary backup?
Um, right. So there is this perception that it would be hard uh, to guarantee Ukraine's security, given how with deployed troops, given how long the contact line is with Russia and the front line and so on. But I think most important factor that we should remember here, that in any case, in any scenario of the ceasefire, Ukrainian armed forces will not go anywhere, so they'll be always the first line of defense, which means that the requirements for in terms of numbers for European deployment it shouldn't be that high. I mean, I mentioned the maximalist version and the minimalist version. So in the maximalist scenario, you would need to have a combat force of 60 to 80,000 people, that in case if we have in the event of Russian trying to violate the ceasefire, that they would act together with the Europeans and together with Ukrainians and simply will help Ukrainians to not just to absorb the Russian attack, but also to uh, to to uh, push through the Russian defense lines and essentially then helping Ukrainian army to go in and to take over its land. So that's a maximalist scenario. It's hard to say that this will happen, but on a minimalist level, we're so uh, if we're talking about the less ambitious mission of training and perhaps repairing equipment, protecting the border, protecting critical infrastructure, then of course in this case we're talking about the numbers that are perhaps range between 10 to 20,000 military personnel.
Mhm.
But again, this so the it's hard to estimate because Europeans would say that the specifics of the mission depends on the U.S. commitment. So only knowing the U.S. commitment to the mission, they can they can elaborate on parameters and the rules of engagement and so on. So there has been a bit of a chicken egg problem here. Europeans wanted commitment from the U.S., knowing to determine how the strengths of its force and different rules of engagement, while Americans telling Europeans, well, you have to take the lead and we will follow you. You tell us what you can contribute and we will define our position. And as far as I know, this chicken egg problem has not been resolved.
Right. And that brings us to another question, which is really about the kind of credibility angle, and specifically with regard to the United States. In your view, do the United States actions over the last week, you know, floating a peace plan in a somewhat uncoordinated way and putting pressure on Ukraine to agree to it in a very short time frame, do those actions, what do those mean for the credibility of any U.S. role in a security guarantee toward troops in Ukraine, let's say, even if there aren't U.S. troops in Ukraine, if if the U.S. entered into some commitment to support European troops in Ukraine, would that be considered credible after what we've just seen in the past week and everything that's gone before it?
Yes, that's a very good question to ask. Again, I think we were uh, the expectation and assumption was that after February and March 2025, that slowly but steadily this administration changed its opinion about um, what Ukraine needs for its defense and the legitimacy of Ukrainian uh, defense needs and security guarantees. And we heard all the statements that were becoming more and more sympathetic towards Ukraine, even to the extent that the administration imposed first sanctions on Russian major oil companies, and even threat, even played around with the idea of sending tomahawks to Ukraine. And then now we have this reversal. So apparently, while uh, there were and particularly the way it was kind of organized, this 2028 peace point plan in a secret, um, over the heads of Europeans, over the heads of Ukrainians. So it kind of throws us back to where we were in January, February, and to when we had all these fears that there will be a quick, dirty deal between Putin and Russia, and then, then essentially Ukraine will be thrown under the bus. So I think it's legitimate to ask questions. To what extent the U.S. administration can be trusted in any security commitments, especially when the one they put on the table about that U.S. and other allies will come to Ukraine's help. Um, so it's important now for um, Europeans to work now with Ukraine and uh, to restore this sort of trust. So in my optimistic scenario is that when now with European input and Ukrainian input, when this 28 peace point plan will be readjusted, reorganized, and sent back to Moscow, it's it's very likely then that Putin will reject it and we'll be back on the same track where we were before. So that this will give Trump administration pretext to finally act uh, seriously on the sanctions and on exercising other leverage that it has on Russia. So if we'll back on that track, I think um, then perhaps there will be some measures of trust reestablished between Ukrainians and Americans.
Hmm. Thanks. Another question from my side. You brought up the question of the political viability of a of let's say European forces to support a peace agreement. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. What is, you know, and I'm also mindful of the fact that, in a way, this debate, it's noteworthy that the Russian side is not really engaging in any kind of debate about what it might be willing to do. It has, re floated its maximalist positions. And so we're all talking about them again, and there's pressure on Ukraine to change its position, and no pressure on Russia to, at least at this point, to indicate any flexibility or any concessions that it would be willing to entertain. So there's a sense in which this whole discussion is advancing the Russian interest and not the Western or European or American or Ukrainian interest. But leaving that aside, the question of the political viability of a deployment, do you see that, as having changed, for example, with regard to Germany, where there's been a change in government since the original proposal that French President Macron raised in February of 2024? There's now a government led by Friedrich Merz, the CDU and the SPD, and there have been evolutions in other places in Europe as well. So, how do you assess the political feasibility of European troops in Ukraine as part of the backstop for a either a ceasefire or some further reaching arrangement?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a major question, Jeff, and it has been hunting Europeans for a very long time. Um, not just with the idea to deploy in Ukraine, but also if you look in the past deployment missions, be it in Afghanistan or Iraq or Bosnia, there's always this question of sustainability, and then the interest wanes over time, and there is a domestic pressure to withdraw troops and so on. So this problem is always there, but I do think there is a room uh, to step up and to improve in terms of participation. So there have been, even though we have these 26 flags now in the list of 26 countries that pledge some sort of support, military support. Very few of them actually said that they will send troops out. So just the UK, France, and perhaps Estonia, Lithuania, and Belgium. So obviously, who's missing here is Germany. Germany needs to also lead or co-lead with these three, together with France and the UK, and in the E3 format. Um, and of course, the German position so far has been hesitant, but that they haven't ruled out the deployment in the way, for example, that Italy and Poland did. And very often in the public discussion about the viability of this force, there is this argument that while we don't have enough troops, or we need to our troops are tied, linked to our NATO commitments, and therefore we cannot really use those capabilities in Ukraine. But I think it's very it's not convincing argument, because it sends kind of sort of creates an illusion that you have two different wars on the continent. So it was two different adversaries. There is the war in Ukraine and there is a war against Europe, even though Europeans fight the same adversary, and that also doesn't really goes well with the all the rhetoric of Europeans saying, European security is Ukrainian security, and Ukraine is defending European security. So uh, there is, if this is true, then then at some point you'll have to not just rhetorically commit yourself, but also tangibly commit yourself. And if countries like Baltic states, if they are the ones that should be probably most worried about the fact that when they are sending troops to Ukraine, they might expose themselves to a future Russian attack. But they are not. They said, "Yeah, we will send troops to Ukraine because we realize that it's it's much cheaper or easier, strategically more prudent to stop Russia in Ukraine rather than hide behind our borders and wait until the fire comes to us."
Right.
So it's essentially a question: where do you want the border between Russia and NATO to be? On the current front line, or on Polish-Ukrainian border?
Right. So we've got two last bits that I'll try to take together. The first is a question, and that is about what effect might a strengthened Western commitment to Ukraine, what effect might that have on Russia and its allies or supporters, in this case, North Korea and China? Is there some sense in which there's a symmetry? A strengthened Western commitment might lead to strengthened involvement from those two countries on Russia in Russia's support. And then the second is more of a comment, which is just a note about the nuclear side of the equation, and especially the signaling that was observable in the run-up to the war, in case you want to comment on that. But we'll give you the last round here, Iulian, and then we'll wrap.
Um, right, good questions. I think what this European deployment uh, in Ukraine can do is essentially seize the initiative when it comes to the escalation dynamics. So far, um, Russians had an upper hand in this. They have been escalating while Europeans and or Americans have always been responding with de-escalation. And I think what the arrival of European forces in Ukraine can do, they can change this calculation and essentially disrupt this upper hand that Moscow had, and essentially forced Moscow to face the possibility that European escalation could make this war unwinnable for Russia. The nuclear element, um, of course, that's it has been there. Um, unfortunately, we have seen that way too often. The Ukraine's partners actually gave in to this nuclear cyber rattling coming from Moscow. Um, eh, apart from the only case when the Biden administration did not give in to the fear of escalation, but actually pushed back, and that was the time around September 2022 when they were uh, reporting that Putin was considering using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine because of Ukrainian counteroffensive. And that was the moment when actually, probably the only time when the Biden administration did push back seriously, saying that, look, if this would happen, there will be conventional military response, and that worked. And so I think we should draw on this example and kind of draw an inspiration that um, drawing a lesson that if we clearly draw the line and clearly communicate this red line to Russia and back this up with our capabilities, there's a high chance that Russians will stand down. The nuclear deterrence works both ways, and it's hard time to reestablish the balance of fear because by until today we have been fearing Russia much more than Russia has been in fear of us.
Okay, well, I think that is a great place to wrap up this really terrific webinar. I want to thank you, Iulian, for your insights and analysis. I want to thank our audience for being with us today, and I especially want to thank those who posed questions and participated in the discussion. So we are going to wrap now, but I want to thanks once again to all of you, and we look forward to having you with us on future events. We've got many upcoming in the coming weeks, and we look forward to having you with us. So thanks so much, and all the best. Bye bye.
Thank you.